back to the psych office together with a check payment or cash payment for psychi as well, and they will take care of all the rest. We're passing applications right after April 1st, so that is our deadline, and this semester we're actually going for mine. So you can also find applications online at psychiunr through the university website. So you'll be able to find us, and on there you have to fill out the physical application and print it out because we have to verify your GPA. So if you fill out the online one, we'll have to contact you and tell you that you will have to redo it. So it would be great if you help us skip a step. I believe that's it for Psychi, so thank you guys very much for coming, and here's Dana.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank you guys for coming out for what I think is going to be a really fascinating talk. Before we start, I want to mention the Psycho Student Alliance, one of the clubs that helped organize this event, in collaboration with Psychi and the Nevada Reno Society. If you get a chance, please check out our table in the back. You'll learn more about who we are and what we do. Also, all of our events are free of charge because we want to make them accessible to all members of the community. But generosity has consequences, and we're always in debt. We're always looking at financial wounds. So if you guys can make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it. There's a donation bid on the table, and donations will be split between the three clubs. Yeah, those are the credit cards. So our speaker is Dr. Sarah Strand. Dr. Strand received her bachelor's at Iowa State University in Animal Sciences. She received her master's in psychology at the University of Massachusetts, studying stress and environment in Morgan, Maryland. She went on to earn her PhD at the University of Massachusetts on rearing experiences and social development in rhesus monkeys. Dr. Strand teaches several classes at Sacramento State University and works at California National Primate Research Center at UC. So the topic tonight is the neurobiology of religious experience. And I've come to realize that this is actually somewhat of a controversial topic. I know several people who would argue that science either cannot or perhaps should not study topics of this nature. Personally, I think controversy of this sort might be a good thing because it implies that science is doing its job of pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and challenging the way we think about the world. So I hope you got an open mind, and I hope you have questions you can ask Dr. Strand later on. With that, please help me welcome.
Thank you, Gennady, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. My apologies for my lateness, the traffic and the vista-like views, and also getting lost on campus kind of kept me from getting here. So my apologies. I'm so happy to see so many faces that are interested in learning about the neurobiology of religious experiences tonight. So I hope that we can have a great discussion. I hope if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I'm perfectly okay with accepting questions as I go along. In fact, at some points when we're getting into some of the neurobiology, I may actually stop and ask, how you guys doing? You following along? Have any questions? That kind of thing. I'm perfectly happy to do that. So what I want to start off with is a bit of an introduction about the scientific study of religion. Because as Gennady said, this is not, it's a bit controversial, and there are certain people who think that science has no business in religion and religion has no business in science. So how in the heck did a field like this get started? William James was an American psychologist and philosopher who was actually trained as a physician. And he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experiences, published in the early 1900s. And in this, he recommended that religion be studied scientifically. And so the beginnings of what we might call scientific inquiry into religion and religious experiences began with that book. And over the course of many decades, this field has actually earned a name for itself called neurotheology. Now, what in the heck does neurotheology mean? Well, neurotheology can take on a broad range of definitions. Scientists debate exactly what should be included. And so if I'm going to keep this talk down to 45 to 50 minutes, and not go on for days and days and days, we should get on the same page about what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of neurotheology. So for the purpose of this talk, neurotheology examines the neurobiological underpinnings of religious behavior and experience. Religious experiences, as defined by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, can be broadly defined as an experience that seems to the person having them to be of some objective reality and to have some religious import. So in other words, they feel that they are real and true and happening, and they have some kind of religious signature to them. And what I'm going to focus on in this talk specifically with respect to neurobiology and neurotheology is out-of-body experiences. These tend to be the hallmark religious experiences that individuals have. So I'm going to start off by giving where's my plan? Okay, how did I do that?
Yeah, sure.
All right. I don't know how to get rid of that. The top one? Oh, yeah, right. Okay. So first we're going to talk about what exactly out-of-body experiences are and how they happen. And then we're going to talk about what makes an out-of-body experience religious, because there are people who have out-of-body experiences that don't categorize them as religious. So what would make an out-of-body experience religious? Then we're going to talk about what the implications are for the field of neurotheology in general, and then I'm going to give some overall conclusions. All right. So from here on out, I'm going to abbreviate out-of-body experience as OBE, because when I have to say it over and over and over and over again, I sometimes start to trip over myself. So we all know from this point forward, OBE means out-of-body experience. And this is specifically an experience that involves a sensation of floating outside of one's body. The term was originated by Tyrrell when he wrote a book called Apparition, which was published in the early 60s. An out-of-body experience, or OBE, replaced what had previously been called things like spirit walking and astral projection, because it was seen as a bit more of a neutral term, right? The astral projection or spirit walking has a bit of a spiritual, maybe religious kind of connotation to it, whereas out-of-body experiences can be looked at a little bit more objectively and able to study it without such concepts as the soul being introduced into it. And individuals who experience an out-of-body experience, or an OBE, tend to report 5 general characteristics. The first is a feeling of peace and connection with the universe. The second is a sense of release from the body. The third commonly reported characteristic is movement down a dark tunnel, sometimes the vision of a bright light, and oftentimes vision of deities or other people from their lives. Now, I include other people from their lives because there are children who have had out-of-body experiences that report seeing things like Big Bird. So that could be considered another person from their lives, and not necessarily a deity, although maybe in the eyes of the child, Big Bird is a deity. So I'm going to talk specifically about 2 patient testimonies that each include some of these elements. But more importantly, there is one major difference between these 2 testimonies. These were patient testimonies that were given to Dr. Kevin Nelson at the University of Kentucky. He works in the Department of Neurology. The first patient testimony was given by Patrick. Patrick had an out-of-body experience when he had a heart attack. In the emergency room, he became paralyzed and slowly floated up and saw his body on the gurney in the emergency room. Later, he recalled the experience by saying he was about to meet his maker. Okay? So what he's described there basically is a sense of floating up out of one's body. He doesn't specifically talk about feeling connection with the room, but he is able to see and experience the whole room outside of just what his own body would occupy. Presumably his eyes were closed, and so he's able to see more of the room than he himself occupies. But he later categorizes that religiously, as in he's about to meet his maker. A second patient, Karen, heard her next door neighbor, a state trooper, accidentally discharge his weapon. And in doing so, he almost killed his wife. Accidentally, it was not purposeful. But as a result, Karen went to bed feeling a little uneasy, a little unsettled. Laying in bed, between sleeping and waking, Karen began floating a few feet above herself. She turned and saw her husband lying next to her, and after drifting around the room for a few more moments, the next thing I remember is waking up the next morning. And that's all that Karen has to say about that. She doesn't explicitly say that it was religious. She doesn't explicitly say that she was about to meet her maker. She's very just straightforward telling what she experienced. But all of them have, or both of these testimonies have similar characteristics of what we might call an OBE. So the major difference is that Patrick interpreted his out-of-body experience as religious, but Karen didn't. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more, about why that might be. But first, I want to get us all on the same page about when out-of-body experiences typically happen. They often happen in near-death situations. So Patrick would be a good example of that. He had a heart attack and he was lying in the emergency room on a gurney. That could be classified as a near-death experience. We can also have out-of-body experiences when we take certain drugs, and I'm going to talk about ketamine specifically in a few slides. And we can also have them during what's called the hypnagogic and hypnopompic stages of sleep. This would be something that would be categorized by Karen's out-of-body experience. Hypnagogic and hypnopompic describes that phase where you're awake and falling asleep, and you're still kind of aware of your surroundings. You're not quite asleep yet, but you're not exactly awake. So that first stage, going from awake to asleep, is the hypnagogic stage of sleep. And then when you're asleep and you're just starting to wake up, maybe your alarm has gone off and you have it set to a radio station and you start to incorporate the DJs and what they're saying into a dream that you're having, right? That could be described as the hypnopompic stage of sleep. It happens right between when you're waking up from sleep but not quite awake. Karen's report said that as she was falling asleep, she started to float out of her body, right? So that would be characteristic of the hypnagogic stage of sleep. So there's something that's happening consistently, similarly in our brains in each of these situations that's creating a similar out-of-body experience. So what exactly is that? How do out-of-body experiences happen? Well, there's this neuroscientist, Olaf Blum, who works at the Federal Polytechnic School in Lausanne, which is in Switzerland. And he was investigating, trying to determine the source of a woman's seizures. And so what he was doing is he had her brain basically open while she was awake on the table. The brain doesn't have any pain receptors, right? So when you're stimulating the brain, you don't actually feel any pain. Of course, she was asleep when they were opening her skull and cutting through skin and muscle, and then they, had her anesthetized so she wouldn't feel any of that pain, local anesthetic. But she was still awake and cognizant, so he could actually see what the effect of his stimulation was when he was stimulating certain parts of the brain. Well, when Olaf stimulated the parietal lobe, specifically an area of the brain called the angular gyrus, he unexpectedly produced an out-of-body experience. How did he know that? Well, the woman reported, I'm floating above my body, I see my body on the table. She was reporting seeing things around the room that she couldn't actually visually access from her position. She was having an out-of-body experience. So the angular gyrus, so you can see this is the frontal lobe, this is the front part of the face. The temporal parietal junction, or the angular gyrus, sits right about here. And you can kind of see some of the major divisions of the brain from this picture. Our brains have many sulci and gyruses. It is what enables us to have so much surface area packed into such a small space, right? And our brains are divided by large gyruses. You see one large one right here, separating both the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. You see another one highlighted in blue there, but the vertical line that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This horizontal blue line separating the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. Okay? So we have these major divisions, and the angular gyrus sits at one of the intersections between two of those lobes, the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. So it's called the temporal parietal junction. The parietal lobe has some specific functions. The left parietal lobe is responsible for an awareness of the space of one's own body. So standing here in front of you, I know where my body is. I know where my elbow is without having to look at it and touch it. I know where my pinky toe is without having to reach out and touch it, okay? My left parietal lobe gives me an awareness of the space that my body occupies. The right parietal lobe, on the other hand, is responsible for our sense of physical space in which the body exists. So I know that if I want to go over and take a look at my computer, I have to turn my body and walk in this direction in order to reach my computer. Okay? So the left and the right parietal lobe work together to tell us the space that our body occupies, as well as the actual physical space in which our body exists. The interaction between the right and left parietal lobes enables us to accurately move our bodies from point A to point B. You guys with me so far? So recall some of the common characteristics of out-of-body experiences. The first one was the sense of peace and connection, and the second one was a sense of release from the body. So you can see how disrupting the activity of the parietal lobe might actually cause some of these experiences. When you can no longer distinguish between your body, the space that your body occupies, and your non-body space, you feel connected with everything around you. And the majority of people report that as a peaceful feeling. Some people report that as a scary, negative feeling, but the vast majority of people report that as being a positive, peaceful feeling, and they feel connected with their environment because they no longer can distinguish their body from their non-body space. So during an out-of-body experience, what we learned from Olaf Blunk is that neural activity in the angular gyrus is disrupted. And we know now that it's actually reduced. So the angular gyrus kind of turns off for a second, disrupting the connection between the left and right parietal lobes, and we start to sort of float, feel one with the space around us and connected with the space around us. So our comprehension of self, time, and space gets disrupted. And it can be disrupted artificially, like Olaf Blunk did, specifically stimulating that particular area of the brain. But it can also be disrupted naturally, as in when we are going from awake to falling asleep, or being asleep and waking up, and also when we're taking certain drugs. That's in a few more slides. Recall also that one of the common characteristics of out-of-body experiences is vision of deities or other people. Well, the angular gyrus also borders the occipital cortex, or the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is what is responsible for vision. And one of the most remarkable things is that stimulation of the temporal parietal junction reduces activity in the parietal lobe, but it does not do anything to the occipital lobe. Right, so we start to feel a sense of connection with our environment around us. We start to actually, feel like we're one with the rest of the space around us. But our activity in our occipital lobe isn't compromised at all. And what's happening in these connections is that our emotions, or any kind of emotional signature that we might attach to particular images or particular thoughts that in our head, raise the probability that one may trigger the other, right? So this area that's connecting certain limbic structures of the brain is disrupted, but the occipital lobe is not disrupted at all. And so oftentimes what happens is that if a particular person who's experiencing an OBE is thinking about or missing, or there's a particular person or deity that's in the forefront of their mind, that an image of that person may actually appear. Okay, so there are certain people who have out-of-body experiences that report seeing Jesus, report seeing God. Well, those are the kind of people that tend to categorize out-of-body experiences as religious. then one might anticipate seeing God or seeing Jesus. And since the occipital lobe is not turned off, that is an extreme likelihood to actually be able to see that person. Ellen G. White was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventists. She frequently had visions that people paid attention to and listened to, but she was also diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy. We're going to talk a little bit more about why this is relevant when we get to the work of Michael Persinger. I suppose you don't have speaker audio on here, do you?
Oh,
We do? Okay. I'm gonna need it in a few slides. What's interesting is that temporal lobe epilepsy is the most common form of epilepsy when you don't have seizures until you're an adult. When you start having them when you're a kid, there are other sources of when I say temporal lobe epilepsy, I mean that's the initial point where the excess electrical activity occurs, and then the seizure happens because it spreads throughout the entire brain. So temporal lobe epilepsy is the most common adult diagnosed form of epilepsy, but if you're diagnosed as a child, you can have there are other forms. But the temporal lobe is one of the things that's critical in categorizing an out-of-body experience as religious, which I'm going to get to when we talk about Olaf Blanc. So, I'm sorry, when we talk about Michael Persinger. So what we have right now, this is what we know so far. We know that the angular gyrus is critical in having an out-of-body experience because when Olaf Blanc stimulated it, an out-of-body experience occurred. We also know that the angular gyrus sits at the junction of the temporal and parietal lobes, and that the parietal lobe specifically is responsible for our sense of self, and not a sense of self, but the sense of the physical space that our body occupies and how our body is different from our non-body space. And that when that is disrupted, oftentimes individuals experience an OBE where they float up out of their body, they feel connected with the environment around them, and they feel a sense of calm and peace. And occasionally this is also accompanied by visions. What I want to emphasize is that the experiences that people are having are not, miscategorizations or wishful thinking. They are actually experiencing these things that can be shown through fMRI studies. There is truth in the experiences that these people are having. But what makes them problematic for the rest of us is that it's really difficult to verify the actual experience that this person is having because there are no external cues for it, right? So imagine you were in an fMRI machine. People know what an fMRI machine is? Functional magnetic resonance imaging. Okay. When you're in an fMRI machine, what's happening, you can have individuals do tasks, look at pictures. And what's cool about the fMRI machine is that the fMRI machine tracks the flow of blood to the areas of the brain that you're using at that particular time, because blood has magnetic properties to it. And areas of the brain that are most active are going to use more blood, so blood's going to flow to that area. So let's say you're in an fMRI machine and you're shown a picture of a piece of apple pie. Okay? What kinds of activations in our brain might we see? Well, we see activation in the occipital lobe, right? Because we are looking at a picture. We're using our occipital lobe to process what that information is. We might actually see activation of the piriform cortex, which processes smell. We're looking at pictures of how we process smell. But when you think about apple pie, you also smell it. You can recall what that smells like. In fact, some of our most powerful memories have those olfactory signatures to them. We might actually see some activation in the amygdala as well. The amygdala is the region of the brain that's used to process emotional memories. Maybe you had a good time cooking apple pie with your grandma, and you're transported back to her kitchen when you were a small child helping her bake this pie. All of these things are possible just from looking at a picture in an fMRI machine. But we can't verify what the person is actually experiencing. We're relying on the person to tell us what's going through their mind, what they're actually experiencing and thinking about when all this activation is happening. So one of my favorite studies is done by Andrew Newberg. He wrote a book called Principles of Neurobiology. And one one of the papers that he talks about in this book is a study where he put Tibetan monks in an fMRI machine, okay? And he looked at their brains before meditation and during meditation. All right, so here's a picture of the brain of a Tibetan monk before they do any kind of meditation. You see lots of activation. Darker red means more activation, the blue colors is cooler, that means less activation. So you're seeing some kind of generalized, I don't know what they're doing in there, maybe they're just hanging out in there, maybe they're having conversations with the MRI technician, not really sure. But this is before meditation. This in an fMRI machine, got a baseline level of activation, and then he taught them a, several sentence mantra kind of meditation, which he wanted them to do for 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks straight. 12 minutes, 8 weeks straight. When he put these individuals back into the fMRI machine after those 8 weeks, he saw something very similar. He saw that there was a lot more activation in the frontal lobe, and when he put these patients through tests of memory, different memory tasks, he found that they had improved 10 to 15%. Okay, so this kind of activation doesn't necessarily have to be categorized as specific to a religious experience, right? This is one thing that I really like about Newberg's work, Principles of Neurobiology. He's very careful not to